All right, so in today's video, I want to walk through an analysis I recently finished focused on post-ordinals Bitcoin outputs worth 1,000 sats or less. These tiny outputs make up the bulk of all the outputs created since Ordinals was launched, and many of them remain unspent to this day. So it's kind of an interesting set of outputs to study. What I wanted to understand specifically was how much users have spent in fees to create these outputs, and then also how closely were they following the dust limit thresholds for different script types. So here's the visualization. Let's get familiar with kind of what we're looking at here. On the x-axis, we have the output amount. So it ranges from, as little as 1 sat in some cases, all the way up to 1,000 sats. And that's the threshold that I made the cutoff for this analysis. And then on the y-axis, we have the estimated fee paid to create each output. Okay. And that ranges, from 1 sat all the way up to a whole Bitcoin and slightly above in this kind of one odd case. It's important to note that this isn't the total fee for the whole transaction. It's just the cost of creating each individual output. So I estimated it by multiplying the transaction's fee rate by the expected size of the output's script, and then that gave me, this estimate to create the output, the estimated fee to create the output. So each point here on this chart represents a single output. The color shows the script type, and that's not really the main focus here, but it's relevant because each script type has a different dust limit. And then I've added vertical lines to mark those limits. So we have the P2W PKH dust limit, which is the lowest one at 294 sats. Okay. Taproot dust limit is at 330 sats, and it's the same dust limit actually as P2WSH. Okay, and then on the upper end here we have P2SH dust limit at 540 sats, and then at the top P2 PKH at 546 sats. Okay, so those are the dust limits, and we don't really need to talk about why they differ, but just for the purposes of this analysis, just know that they do differ depending on the script type. Okay, so these are the minimum output values generally accepted by default relay policy. There are also on this chart several diagonal lines, kind of more horizontal, right, which show key uh, creation fee to output value ratios or output amount ratios, and they go up by orders of magnitude. So most notably, here's the 1-to-1 ratio, meaning the fee to create this output was the same as the output amount. Okay, and then above it is a 10-to-1 ratio, and below it is, a 0.1 ratio. Okay, so looking at the chart as it is here with all of the outputs displayed, we notice that most of these outputs lie kind of in a pretty tight band, right? Most of them are paying, either a tenth of a fee up to kind of the same amount of fee, or maybe even up to 10x fee as the output amount. But it's fairly well constrained. And then there's some outliers where, they're paying way, way higher fees, but not too many, right? Most of them kind of lie in that few orders of magnitude range below. There's also over to the left, a few kind of non-standard outputs that are below the dust limits, but those are also pretty rare. Okay, so if we lower the opacity like this, right, we see the density patterns emerge, and these kind of just indicate where most of the outputs have been created. So either where they've been created in terms of their output amounts, right? So like here at 500 or 600, or, obviously on the dust limit lines, there's pretty dense amounts of these outputs. But then also there's some horizontal lines which indicate that, there's a propensity to to create outputs at certain fee creation amounts, right? So that's kind of interesting as well. If we look at each individual script type, and I'll kind of summarize some of the results here. For pay to taproot, there were over 100 million outputs created, but only 23 million of those were on the dust limit line. Everything else was above it. And then for P2WPKH, the next one, again, 51 million, over 51 million outputs created, but in this case, only just under 19 million were on the dust limit. Okay. For pay to script hash, this one was even kind of even crazier, right? There was 5.5 million created, but only a little bit over 100,000 on the dust limit. Everything else was either above, and then there was a bit more on this P2PKH dust limit, right? But very few relative to the rest of them was actually at the dust limit here. So that was an interesting anomaly. Okay, and then the rest actually, well, I'm just going to skip over this others because these are kind of odd. But P2PKH, if we go here, okay, this one actually had most on the dust limit. So this one had just under a million on the dust limit of the 1.5. And then P2WSH, this one also had most of them on the dust limit. So a little bit under 800,000 were on the dust limit of about a million in total. Okay. So all in all, that is roughly 44 million outputs created right at the dust line, but over 162 million total were created in this range. So more than 2/3 of the outputs were created above their dust threshold, meaning users weren't, just scraping the minimum, right? They were voluntarily putting more value in these outputs. In terms of the fees paid, so this is another interesting breakdown. Of the 162 million outputs analyzed, the total value stored in these outputs was just shy of 80 billion sats, and the total fees paid to create them was over 250 billion sats. Okay. So, this is about a 3-to-1 ratio between the fees paid and the value stored. So, yeah, I mean, users are paying way more in fees than they are in output amounts. And that actually is the same across all different types, right? We see those ratios. I think in some cases it's a 2-to-1 ratio, in others it's a 4-to-1, but overall, it's pretty close kind of to 3-to-1, right? So, that's another interesting observation, is that these users, kind of independent of script type, are paying mostly in fees instead of the output. Okay. So just to break down everything, just to kind of summarize everything rather, Bitcoin users have created over 162 million outputs, right? Below 1,000 sats since ordinals were released. They've spent over 250 billion sats in fees just to store 80 billion sats in those outputs. And only about 27% of those outputs were created at the dust limit. The rest were above it, okay? And a very small fraction below, but those are pretty negligible. That last point is important. So it means that most of the activity is voluntary, right? They're not just hugging the policy boundary. So does that mean the dust limit no longer matters? Well, I mean, not necessarily, right? The dust limit still plays a role in discouraging economically irrational outputs, especially when fees are low and incentives get a little weird. But also, this analysis shows that fees alone already create a strong economic filter, right? People aren't creating outputs for free, they're burning massive amounts of sats to do it. So if anything, this highlights how much behavior on the network is now shaped by use case driven incentives, even when they come at a high cost, right? And even if the dust limit were to get removed, you would see a lot of this use throttled by fee rates alone. So that's kind of what I wanted to share. Hope you like this analysis and this breakdown. If you have any questions, let me know, or any comments, feel free to comment or reach out. Thanks.